I Okay. I have divided it in two sections. I will briefly explain something about the broader project in which this sits before delving into a case study. Um, to begin with, for Italy, there is nothing comparable to comprehensive bibliographies of newspapers such as those published for Germany, France, the Low Countries, or Great Britain. In the 1980s, the Italian journalist and historian Ugo Bellocci provided an overview of the various newspapers printed in Italian cities in the 17th century, and he identified some collections containing printed newspapers, but he did not provide a comprehensive survey of this material, leaving other scholars, including Pier Angelo Bellettini, to comment on this, saying that it is surprising to note that even today we do not have a definitive framework for the origins of the Italian periodical printed press. And he made this remark in 1998. So now we're several decades later again, and this continues to be the case. We know surprisingly little about these publication ventures. And what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to undertake a comprehensive study, a bibliography of this early printed newspapers in Italy. Next slide, Annemieke. What I wanted to highlight briefly is that, and you can see the quote on the slide, that in 1639 from Genova, we have a Genoese, Gianettino Giustiniani. He's an informal envoy of the French, but he also writes to the Florentines, and he writes about a new practice that evolves in the city, and it means that they started to print the handwritten newsletter. So that's what's on the slide, and the first copy of the known newspaper from Genova is on the other side of the quote. Just to introduce the fact that it started around 1639 on the Italian peninsula. Next slide, please, Annemieke. What is important to note, and I will not go into detail into this, is that these newspapers largely copied the manuscript ones, which had been really important on the peninsula since the 16th century, and resembled them as much as possible, as you can see here on the slide. News was organized in a very specific way, preceded by a headline consisting of a place and a date, and then divided into paragraphs, as you can see. And due to the prominence of this Avviso model, the Italian newspapers did not have standard titles. Next slide, please, Annemieke, to just show. These are a bit small, but I hope you can see. The middle one is a Dutch one. It's the Courante uit Italië en de Duitsland. It has a title which is always the same throughout, and it has it's numbered. And what you can see on the other, flanked by this, is Italian examples from one from Genova and one from Foligno, and they don't have a title. And they were not numbered. They and very often lacked also imprint information, and that means so we don't know actually for sure where they were printed or the address of the printer. And these are important features according to press historians, so the title, the numbering, to turn newspapers into a recognizable product. And here is what partly sparked my interest. Italian newspapers differ quite substantially from these standards, from what we know from other European regions, who all have these kind of different, or a set of these characteristics. I think next slide. Oh no, back. Sorry. The lack of a title and imprint, together with the typographical inconsistencies that you can also see, for instance, on the Genova newspaper, where you can see they use different font sizes altogether, makes it difficult at times to find these newspapers in libraries and in archives, because they have not been properly catalogued. And after working on this material for several years now, I can't really blame the librarians or the archivists for putting this material to the side, because it's very difficult to know how to describe them. The lack of the title and the lack of an imprint makes it extremely hard to be certain where a specific newspaper was printed, as it is very unclear at times, and sometimes even the place starts to disappear, so we only have the date at the top of the newspaper. So, as I said, instead of growing standardization, which occurs throughout European cities, Italian newspapers completely defy this model. This was briefly to say what the context of what I've been working on, and so far, and I'm almost finishing looking for more of these newspapers, is that I've seen roughly 30,000 copies of these newspapers for the 17th century. So what I've also done in my project is not to just look at newspapers printed on the Italian peninsula, but include newspapers printed in the Italian language, but outside of the Italian states and outside of Italian-speaking areas. And this is where I wanted to delve into today with you all. Given the focus of this cost action, I've decided to focus on the Italian language newspapers published in the Holy Roman Empire. Next slide, please, Annemieke. So during his work on the Storia del giornalismo italiano, so the history of Italian journalism, the journalist and historian Ugo Bellocci discovered this unknown newspaper title in the Archivio di Stato di Modena, which you can see here on the slide. The only information available to Bellocci to identify where this newspaper might have been printed, next slide please, Annemieke, was at the top, as we've seen. So this is very common in Italian newspapers, but also here we have, it has Ems, 2nd of January 1675, and the announcement at the bottom, where we can also see the name, Michael Giovanni Scipio, and it says news writers in Ems. Next slide, Annemieke. What is interesting is that according to Bellocci, this newspaper must have been printed in the Swiss Confederacy, which is now known as Domat Ems, and I've put like a little dot where Domat Ems is. As you can see, it's not to where most of the larger cities were within the Swiss Confederacy, but this is part of the Graubunde, the Grison, the Grey League in English. And ever since Bellocci made this claim that this is the oldest weekly newspapers printed abroad in Italian in this place in Switzerland, this has been repeated. So these weekly ordinary notices are printed there according to Bellocci. But to me, this seemed like a very unlikely place for such an enterprise. As you can see, it's a relatively mountainous and rural region of the Swiss Confederacy, and almost all newspapers in Europe to this point were printed in important commercial and political cities. But what is more crucial is that I've been trying to find whether they have or had a newspaper whether they had a printing press in the 17th century, and it turns out they didn't. So that makes it quite a curious case of how are you going to print a newspaper without a printing press. So initially I settled on the idea that the newspaper could have been written in Domat Ems and perhaps printed in nearby Chur, which is really close by. But I was not really convinced of my own hypothesis here. So next slide, please, Annemieke. So I decided to look for more information of this about this newswriter called Michael Giovanni Scipio. And this turned out to be a more fruitful path because I found an individual named Michael Scipio, so it seems already likely, whose occupation was a newswriter, and he lived in the household of a printer, Georg Weibel, in Hohenems. And as you can see on on the slide, the dot on the map is where Domat-Ems is, and then if you follow the route up to the lake, we pass by Hoornerhems. And this is where he had various encounters with the law. He was once punished because he wrote a libel, and he was once punished because he ended up in a fight with a journeyman, Hans Baumann, who also lived in the household of this bookseller and printer, who was Georg's Bible. Next slide, please. Here we see it's one of the few surviving copies that we have of Bible. His production, he printed quite a lot of material on behalf of newly established Jesuit college in nearby Feldkirch. And he was active as a bookbinder and a printer in this city for a few years. What is interesting is that Hoornerhems, I cannot pronounce it really well, is now a small town in the province of Vorarlberg on the border between Switzerland and Austria, close to the Lake of Constance. And at the time, in the 17th century, it was an imperial county ruled by Karl Friedrich from this noble family of Hoornerhems. What is important is that the printer leased the printing press from the noble family, and he ran an independent bookbinding company. So with all this evidence, it seems far more likely that it was this place where the first Italian newspaper was printed rather than in the Swiss Confederacy. And again, it brings us from one unlikely place to another unlikely place, in the sense that also this location, looking at the wider European picture, is quite an unexpected place for such a venture. It was a small sovereign city in a largely rural area of the Holy Roman Empire, and again, not a place such as Paris, Amsterdam, Cologne, or other cities. What is important is that the family who was ruling within this city had close connections to the Italian peninsula. Karl Friedrich, who was the ruler at the time, had studied at Perugia, and he was also married to Cornelia Lucia Altans, which was an important Roman family. And what is interesting as well at this stage is that it's quite a multilingual city, because he continued the policy of his predecessors, and they allowed Jews to settle within the city. So there were various protections for them to live and work within the city. So there is something going on in this place that is quite interesting and might explain why someone decided to start an Italian language newspaper there. But I wanted to delve in a bit more into the audience. Next slide, Annemieke. So I hope you can all read along with the English. I've tried to translate this a little bit. So at the bottom of the copy that was found in the Archivio di Stato di Modena, you can see an announcement. And this is where, of course, he identifies himself as the newswriter in this city, Michael Giovanni Scipio. And he, in this announcement, tells everyone that they can receive the newspaper on a weekly basis when they pay half of the amount needed in advance to the Lindau couriers. And this is also quite an interesting part of the story, is that in trying to avoid the Brenner route, the Tassi postal firm relied on the messengers of Lindau to connect Milan to Lindau itself. And this was a really important postal route that connected, actually across the Alps, and connected Milan to Central and other places within Europe. And it may have been this fast connection via the post to Milan that inspired Scipio to start his business, because it's quite clearly aimed at a Milanese readership or a Milanese audience, because he promises that his newspapers will be franked, so they will arrive as far as Milan at no additional cost. And the sum to be paid is also in Milanese lire. So there clearly is something about being on this important postal route, that he writes the newspaper, has it printed, and then it gets sent along with these postal couriers to other places within Italy, but mainly Milan. We of course also know that this is a surviving copy in the Archivio di Stato di Modena, so we know that the Este dynasty either had a subscription or they received copies from their representatives in Milan. Next slide, please. So far, this was the only known copy that was identified by Bellocci, but I've found another copy in the Vatican Library as part of the Barberini collection of news. And this is number 8. So there is a missing number 7, and because the other one was number 6. What is interesting here as well is that here we can see that the newspaper provided its readers with reports from the cities north of the Alps, and key cities are Cologne and Hamburg, but also Vienna. And then more generally, there is news coming in from the regions around Silesia. What is interesting about this copy is that it does not offer us any indication at all that this initiative was printed in the city or written by Michael Scipio. So it does not have an imprint, it does not have any kind of announcements where the newswriter identifies himself. So what is important here, I think, is that with the lucky survival of the copy in Modena, we have crucial clues to tell the story of this short-lived or perhaps short-lived venture. And the copy kept in Rome offers us further clues that it was not a one-off, but that there were more issues being printed. However, we do not know whether it continued to exist in the following years. We only have 2 copies from from this year itself. So why is this important? I think it shows that foreign language publications in early modern Europe, so outside of their own Sprachraum, are really important to study. Most studies have focused on French language titles, particularly those produced by Huguenot editors in the Dutch Republic. And these have survived relatively well. But these ones, such as the Avisi Ordinari, the weekly ordinary newspaper, have survived pretty poorly. So also other cases that we have, for instance, the first Italian language newspaper printed in Amsterdam, the only evidence we have is that a printer received official permission to print a newspaper, but there is no single surviving copy. This newly identified title also predates the existence of Italian language newspapers in Amsterdam and in Vienna, marking an earlier and previously completely unknown phase of printing newspapers in the Italian language in the Holy Roman Empire. Whereas, and I've reiterated this point quite repeatedly already, while actually it was far more typical for newspapers to emerge in large politically and commercially significant cities such as Amsterdam and Vienna. And this publication appeared in a completely different context altogether. And I think therefore it challenges established chronologies, but it also expands our understanding of news networks at the time. In line with current scholarship, and especially I'm thinking of Rachel Midura's book on the Tassi family, it highlights the importance of postal networks and couriers. These individuals played a crucial role in the provision of news, not just by carrying it, but also because these were the individuals that people had to pay their subscriptions for, and they were the ones who connected the product with the reader. And I think it's also in this case that they contributed to the formation of what we would be able or could call a Transalpine public sphere. It connected diverse urban and regional centers and their hinterlands, and it connected different linguistic and political communities by these individuals that were moving across the Alps. And I think it highlights the importance of smaller centers within our studies. And next slide, Annemieke. And I think this really fits with, this is the overview of where in the 17th century in Italy newspapers started to appear. And once you start going through the list and you end up in 1658, there was a newspaper printed in Macerata, 1660 in Rimini, but if you continue further, there are newspapers in Ancona, in Foligno, Spoleto, Todi. These are all really small cities within the Papal States. These are not the places people would expect newspapers to appear, and yet they do. And I think the regional aspect is quite important to take into account as well. And of course, I'm not saying it's only in the regional centers in Italy, because you also see that Palermo and Naples are up there. But what is really interesting is to see that it's quite a diverse picture in the 17th century. And in many ways, I think the Italian language newspaper that was printed in Hohenems is also fits within this kind of challenging this narrative of only large dominant cities where newspapers started to appear. And lastly, I think what is important is that it does shows us these kind of more trans-regional connections and the crucial role of the Italian language within the wider region, not only, and I think we could see that as an important aspect of it. So this is quite clear when we look at another far more successful initiative. Next slide, please, Annemieke. And that's the Corriere Ordinario. As you can see, they're not really inventive with the titles. It always also refers to these kind of postal connections and here as well. I've already written on the publication of this newspaper a few years ago. What I wanted to highlight here and why I think it's quite important as well is that this initiative sparked my interest because it's an Italian language newspaper that was printed by two people who came from the Habsburg Low Countries. So it's a kind of, it's multilingual and transnational in many ways. Il Corriere Ordinario was started in 1671, and it was mainly intended to control news coverage in and especially about the Hungarian lands. And there, the choice for the Italian language points to the growing ambitions and aims of the emperor on the Italian news, but also on the Italian peninsula. There had appeared in Italy various texts that were highly critical of these policies towards the Hungarian lands, and with France's Louis XIV's eye cast on opening another war in Italy, Leopold I became much more involved in Italian state affairs than his predecessor had been. So this is quite important that it becomes part of this more Habsburg type of trying to influence. And so it almost became a state-sanctioned newspaper printed in Vienna to promote the Habsburg cause for a kind of information war that was being waged at the time. Next slide, please, Annemieke. And what is interesting is that, especially in the context of this cost action, is that the newspaper reached an Italian audience in territories of the Holy Roman Empire and also beyond. We know that it was read in Dresden at the capital city of the Elector of Saxony, but also other members of an Italianate elite. And this is on the slide, you can see the Romanian nobleman Constantin Cantacuzino, who also studied at the University of Pisa, and it's also his bust is still at the university as well. Serves as an excellent example of this group of individuals. He was the High Steward of Wallachia, the Principality of Wallachia, and was an avid collector of books. And sorry, it was not the University of Pisa, but of Padua. And we know that for almost 25 years, he had a subscription to Il Corriere Ordinario, which he also collected. So clearly, we can see a profound influence of this Italian language newspaper, and it's reaching quite a lot of different individuals who have high-ranking positions within various places in Central Europe as well. Next slide, please, Annemieke. But what also happened is that this newspaper had a profound influence on the wider Italian news market. These news accounts were not only sent from Vienna to different courts, but what we can see is that various publishers in different Italian cities started to reprint the Viennese news. And I have selected just two examples. One example you can see is from Milan, where they always say the news was printed at the bottom that it was printed in Vienna, but then reprinted in Milan, and they just simply reprinted it. The same goes for other cities. The other example is from Modena, where also the Imperial Eagle always adorns these kind of publications, and it shows these kind of influences. So all these enterprising publishers, even in smaller towns such as Macerata, started to recopy the information coming from Vienna. And this really means that in the major and minor cities on the Italian peninsula, we get a really streamlining of one single account of what occurred at various stages in the conflicts that, for instance, the Habsburgs were waging on the Ottoman Empire. And so I think Il Corriere Ordinario, without explaining further the content of this newspaper, also illustrates why it's important to break down these more linguistic and national delineations that continue to shape research agendas of news and newspapers to the present day. And that's why I think it's really important to think about these issues also in the context of our cost action, because it's not enough to recognize that news in the early modern period was a transnational phenomenon. I think it's really necessary to start investigating how these different levels shape the circulation and the availability of news, and that sometimes it happened in places where we would least expect it, such as this town close to the Lake of Constance, where all of a sudden an individual started to write an Italian newspaper that reached cities such as Milan, Modena, and even in the collections of the Barberinis in Rome. So this is part of what I'm trying to look at in the context of Italian language publications, but I look forward to your questions on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk, Nina. I hope you can all hear me. I think it's about the time to open the floor for questions. So